On the third Tuesday of April, when the air above Flaxborough carried that faintly damp promise of better weather, and the tulips in Jubilee Square stood in a posture of civic optimism, the Ladies' Restoration Committee convened in the church hall to discuss the vicarage roof. It was a matter which had hovered over the town for several seasons, much like the roof itself, which had acquired a dignified sag suggestive of moral weariness. Mrs. Dalloway, who chaired the committee with a firmness not incompatible with lace cuffs, began by tapping a spoon against a teacup. She believed firmly in the power of gentle percussion to restore order. "Ladies," she announced, "we are here for the roof, not for speculation." This statement, though admirably clear, had the unfortunate effect of encouraging speculation. The vicarage roof had become a conversational landmark. It leaked in two principal places above the guest bedroom and directly over the escritoire where the Reverend Theodore Ashcombe composed his sermons. The latter leak had proved more troublesome, as it required periodic relocation of theology. The Reverend Ashcombe himself was not present at the meeting. He had pleaded prior engagement, which in ecclesiastical terms might mean anything from hospital visitation to strategic avoidance. In his stead, his wife, Mrs. Clarissa Ashcombe, attended in a hat of conscientious modesty and maintained the expression of a woman prepared to defend her gutters. "Reverend Ashcombe assures me," she said in a voice pitched for hymns, "that the repairs are purely structural. There is nothing irregular about the timbers. No one had suggested that there was." But once mentioned, the word irregular settled among the teacups like a particularly resilient crumb. At 3:30, just as the second plate of sponge cake was being reduced to archaeological fragments, Miss Eunice Harper entered in visible agitation. Miss Harper had been the vicarage's housekeeper for 12 years and regarded the premises as a personal extension of her moral jurisdiction. "I beg your pardon," she declared breathlessly, "but there's been a most distressing occurrence." The room stiffened with pleasure. "It's the study window," she continued. "Open!" And the desk drawers disturbed. Mrs. Dalloway inhaled in a manner that might have been taken for respiratory necessity, had it not carried faint triumph. "Disturbed?" she echoed. "Yes. And the Reverend's correspondence box is gone." Silence followed. It was the respectful silence accorded to scandal when it is still wearing its dressing gown. Mrs. Ashcombe's composure wavered only fractionally. "The correspondence box," she repeated. "Are you certain? I dusted it myself this morning." The implication that dusting confers legal authority was left hanging. Within an hour, the rumour had detached itself from its factual moorings and was progressing briskly along High Street. By the time it reached Mr. Pritchard at the ironmonger's, the Reverend had been robbed of sensitive materials. By the greengrocer's account, the vicarage safe had been emptied. There was no safety, but Flaxborough had never considered that an obstacle. Inspector Perbrite received the news at 4 o'clock, delivered by Sergeant Love in a tone suggesting mild inconvenience rather than alarm. "The vicarage window open, sir. Papers missing. Could be nothing." "Could be," Purbright agreed, adjusting his spectacles with an air of professional optimism. He was a man of medium height, with a manner that suggested he had never once interrupted anyone unnecessarily. His suit bore the gentle creases of practical service. He possessed the gift of listening in a way that made others feel both attended to and faintly transparent. They proceeded to the vicarage on foot. It stood at the edge of town behind a hedge that prided itself on discretion. The study window, indeed, was ajar. Inside, the Reverend Ashcombe sat at his desk beneath a strategically placed basin, catching drips from the ceiling with theological patience. He rose upon their entrance. "Inspector," he said warmly, as if welcoming a parishioner to tea, "I fear we are victims of a trifling intrusion." "Trifling is preferable to significant," Perbrite observed. The The desk bore signs of careful untidiness. Papers had been shifted but not scattered. The absence of the correspondence box left a rectangular clarity upon the polished surface. "What was contained in the box?" Perbrite asked mildly. "Letters," replied the Reverend. "Parish matters, private concerns," Mrs. Ashcombe interjected gently. "Nothing of value." "Value is a flexible term," Perbrite remarked. "Sentiment, for example." The Reverend smiled thinly. "I doubt sentiment motivates burglars." Purbright examined the window frame. There were no obvious tool marks, no splintering. It had been opened rather than forced. "Does it latch securely?" he inquired. "Usually," Miss Harper answered from the doorway, where she hovered like a moral footnote. The inspector nodded slowly. "And who has access to the study?" "Only ourselves," Mrs. Ashcombe replied promptly. "And Miss Harper, of course." "And the gardener?" Purbright suggested. "Mr. Blakely tends the grounds," the Reverend said. "He has no cause to enter the house." The word cause lingered. Purbright moved about the room with unhurried precision. His gaze rested briefly on the water-stained sermon pages, then on a faint smear upon the sill, perhaps mud, perhaps merely the weather's signature. "Has anything similar occurred before?" he asked. "Certainly not," Mrs. Ashcombe said with emphasis. Miss Harper's lips parted, then closed. Outside, a small knot of townspeople had assembled at a respectable distance from the hedge. Respectable distance in Flaxborough was a flexible measurement. As Perbrite concluded his initial observations, he glanced once more at the desk. The absence of violence, the neatness of displacement, the choice of item taken, it was not the work of casual trespass. "Inspector," the Reverend ventured, "I trust this will not become exaggerated." Perbrite allowed himself the faintest suggestion of amusement. "In Flaxborough, Reverend, exaggeration requires no encouragement from the police." They departed with polite assurances and no promises. As they walked back toward the station, Sergeant Love ventured, "Looks like mischief, sir." "Possibly," Perbrite replied, though mischief rarely selects correspondence at random. Behind them, the vicarage windows reflected the late afternoon light with studied innocence. In the church hall, Mrs. Dalloway was already retelling events with structural embellishments. By evening, the phrase "Vicarage Whisper" had entered circulation, though no one could say precisely what was being whispered. And in the study, beneath the steady drip of April rain, the empty space upon the desk waited with quiet significance. By 6 o'clock, the vicarage incident had acquired a degree of narrative polish rarely afforded to confirmed facts. Mrs. Dalloway, fortified by sponge cake and civic responsibility, recounted the discovery to her neighbour with a restraint that extended only to breath. The missing correspondence box had grown in importance. Its contents, though unspecified, were now described as of a delicate nature. At the butcher's, Mr. Greeley observed that clergy were often entrusted with confidences of a personal character, a phrase which encouraged imaginative elasticity. In the snug of the King's Arms, Mr. Pritchard declared that open windows in April were a sign of either negligence or conspiracy. No one asked which. Inspector Perbrite was not unaware of this migratory embellishment. He had spent the latter part of the afternoon reviewing what was known, which amounted to very little that was not amplified by tone. The study window had been opened without visible force. The correspondence box alone had been taken. No silver was missing, no obvious valuables disturbed. The vicarage roof still dripped with democratic impartiality. He began the following morning with Miss Harper. She received him in the small sitting-room reserved for callers who might muddy carpets. Miss Harper's posture was as erect as her moral assessments. "I locked the study door at 9 last night," she stated, hands folded in her lap. "As I do every evening. The window was secured. And this morning? It was open. The latch was not broken." "You did not hear anything during the night?" "I sleep lightly," she said, with the faint reproach of one who considers others culpable for unconsciousness. But I heard nothing. Purbright inclined his head. "Has the Reverend received letters of an unusual nature recently?" Miss Harper's lips compressed. "All letters addressed to the Reverend are of a pastoral nature." "Pastoral is a wide meadow," Perbrite observed gently. She hesitated, then added, "There have been certain complaints from parishioners, from concerned parties in Flaxborough, frequently outnumbered actual grievances." Purbright thanked her and crossed to the churchyard, where Mr. Blakely, the gardener, was trimming yew with philosophical indifference. Mr. Blakely possessed the air of a man who trusted hedges more than people. "You've no reason to enter the house?" Purbright asked. "None, sir. Plants are my department. Sermons are not." "You were here yesterday evening?" "Until 5:30. Same as usual." Purbright regarded the man's boots, which bore yesterday's soil, but no trace of study floor polish. "And you observed nothing unusual?" "Only the roof, sir. Still sagging." The inspector permitted himself a small smile. "Yes, it has been remarked upon." By midday he called upon Mrs. Dalloway, whose recollection of events had matured overnight. "It is widely felt," she began before he had asked a question, "that the Reverend may have been imprudent in certain correspondences." "Widely felt by whom?" Perbrite inquired. She considered it. "Well, people. People are rarely unanimous," he replied. She leaned closer. "There was that matter of the parish accounts last autumn. A misunderstanding, I believe." "Regarding?" "Fund allocation. The roof, in fact." The roof, it appeared, was not merely architectural. Perbrite thanked her and proceeded to the parish office, where Mr. Ellis, the treasurer, adjusted his spectacles with defensive precision. There was no impropriety, Mr. Ellis insisted, before being accused. Only a delay in submitting receipts. "Receipts for repairs?" Perbrite asked. "For preliminary assessments?" "Nothing more." "Were any disagreements recorded?" Mr. Ellis hesitated. The Reverend can be firm in administrative matters. "Firmness invites reaction," Purbright observed. Throughout the afternoon the inspector listened more than he spoke. A pattern emerged not of criminal enterprise, but of friction. The Reverend Ashcombe had declined a proposal to host a summer fete on vicarage grounds. He had refused permission for certain notices to be displayed on the church porch. He had, most recently, rebuked an unnamed parishioner in private. By early evening, the absence of the correspondence box began to resemble less a burglary than a selective retrieval. Purbright returned briefly to the vicarage. The study retained its careful untidiness. The drip from the ceiling had slowed, though the basin remained. "Inspector," the Reverend said with courteous fatigue, "has anything been discovered?" "Only that the town possesses an admirable capacity for interpretation." The Reverend smiled faintly. "That has never been in doubt." "May I ask," Purbright continued, "whether any letter in that box might have occasioned embarrassment if mislaid?" Mrs. Ashcombe answered first. "Certainly not." The Reverend's pause was slight, but perceptible. "There are always matters," he said at last, "which one prefers to resolve quietly." "Indeed," Purbright agreed. As he departed, he glanced once more at the window latch. It showed no sign of strain. It had been opened by someone who either possessed a key to the house or was welcomed inside. In the square, conversation still rippled with polite speculation. The phrase "Vicarage Whisper" had acquired an almost affectionate tone. Inspector Purbright, however, found little in the affair that suggested affection. The missing box had not been taken for profit nor by chance. It had been removed with deliberation, and likely by someone who knew precisely what lay within. And in Flaxborough, deliberation was rarely anonymous. Deliberation, once introduced into the air of Flaxborough, tended to settle upon the most suitable shoulders. By Wednesday morning, the town had agreed, without formal vote, that the matter must either be trivial or dreadful. There was little appetite for anything in between. Inspector Purbright began where deliberation most often concealed itself, among those who had spoken least. He called first upon Mr. Lionel Catamole, who occupied a narrow brick house opposite the vicarage, and possessed a habit of trimming his curtains with surgical precision. Mr. Catamole had the look of a man who preferred observation to participation. "Do you overlook the study window?" Perbrite asked mildly, after the necessary preliminaries regarding tea. "In a manner of speaking," Catamole replied, "one cannot avoid noticing what faces one directly. Did you observe anything on Tuesday evening?" Mr. Catamole adjusted his cuff. "I observed the Reverend closing the curtains at approximately 8:45. Thereafter, nothing. No visitors? Not to my knowledge." Though he added with faint reluctance, a motor car was parked briefly near the hedge. "What sort of motor car? A dark saloon? Not local? How can you be certain?" "I make it my business," Mr. Catamole said, with the modest pride of one who catalogues exhaust notes. Purbright nodded. "At what hour?" "Shortly after 9. It did not remain long." "And you did not consider this noteworthy in a Flaxborough, Inspector? Nearly everything is noteworthy. One cannot report it all." Purbright thanked him and made a small notation. "A visitor, after 9. The study, secured at 9. The window, opened by morning." The timeline retained its courtesy. His next call was upon Mrs. Edith Lamport, widow of a railway porter, and possessor of an ear finely attuned to nocturnal disturbance. Her cottage backed onto the lane behind the vicarage garden. "I heard a gate," she said at once, as if relieved to deposit the sound somewhere official. "Metal on metal, about 9:30. The vicarage gate, it could have been, or the allotments. Sound travels in peculiar ways. Any voices? No raised ones. But footsteps. Careful footsteps. Careful in what sense? Measured, not running. Purbright considered this. "Did you look outside?" Mrs. Lamport drew herself up. "I do not peer, Inspector. I listen." Listening in Flaxborough was a civic duty. By early afternoon, Purbright returned to the parish office and requested sight of the recent correspondence log. Mr. Ellis complied with visible discomfort. "There is nothing irregular," he repeated, though the word had begun to resemble an unpaid debt. Purbright scanned the entries: appeals for charity, complaints about hymn selection, a letter from the diocesan board regarding roof repairs, and, noted 3 weeks prior, a communication marked "private hand delivered." "From whom?" Purbright asked. Mr. Ellis cleared his throat. "Miss Prudence Hardwick." "The organist?" "The same. Hand-delivered?" "Yes, she prefers personal communication in sensitive matters." "Of what nature?" Mr. Ellis hesitated. There was disagreement over remuneration. For her services, for additional rehearsals requested by the Reverend. Purbright allowed silence to lengthen slightly. "And was the disagreement resolved?" "So I was told. Miss Hardwick was found in the church, practicing with an energy that suggested repressed argument. She turned as the inspector approached, her fingers lingering upon the keys. "Inspector," she said, neither warmly nor coolly, "I suppose this concerns the theatrical burglary." "Theatrical?" he echoed. "It has acquired staging," she replied. "Everyone whispers as though Hamlet were concealed behind the vestry." "Were you at the vicarage on Tuesday evening?" "I was not." "You wrote to the Reverend recently?" Her expression tightened. "On professional matters? Concerning payment? Concerning fairness? Did you receive a reply?" "Yes." "In writing? In person? Was the matter amicably concluded?" Miss Hardwick's fingers resumed a single, insistent note. "The Reverend assured me my position was secure." "And you were satisfied?" "Satisfaction," she said crisply, "is not always available." Purbright studied her briefly. "Have you ever seen the correspondence box? Everyone has seen it. It sits upon his desk like a reliquary, and you would have no interest in its contents?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Inspector, if I desired to remove something from that house, I should hardly choose the most conspicuous container." A reasonable assertion, though reason in Flaxborough was often employed defensively. As he left the church, the inspector reflected that the missing box, while tangible, might not represent the true object of interest. It had been taken intact, no letters scattered, no single document selected. A container removed entirely suggested urgency or discretion. By evening, Sergeant Love reported that no similar motor car had been observed in town. The description remained indistinct, as most dark saloons did. Purbright sat at his desk reviewing the day's accounts. A car at 9, a gate at past. A window opened without force. A correspondence box was removed whole. The first obvious suspect had not yet presented himself, but human motive was seldom patient for long. In Flaxborough, grievances did not remain buried. They cultivated themselves carefully, like tulips awaiting display. And somewhere between careful footsteps and polite disagreement, the truth had already crossed the vicarage threshold. By Thursday morning, the town had achieved what might politely be called focus. Deliberation, having circulated among organists, treasurers, gardeners, and passing motorists, settled with gratifying neatness upon one individual. Mr. Gerald Wince. Mr. Wince occupied a narrow shop between the newsagent and the cobbler, trading in second-hand books and unverified grievances. He had, in recent months, taken exception to what he termed clerical interference in the proposed relocation of the annual book fair. The vicarage lawn, which Mr. Wince considered an ideal venue, had been refused him on grounds of insurance and propriety. "It is censorship by cassock," he had remarked in the King's Arms to modest applause. Sergeant Love presented the name to Inspector Purbright with the air of a man offering a tidy parcel. "Argument with the Reverend last month, sir." Raised voices. "And he was seen near the vicarage Tuesday evening." "By whom?" "Mrs. Lamport. She believes the footsteps were deliberate." "Mrs. Lamport believes many things deliberate," Perbrite observed mildly. "Nevertheless, we shall call upon Mr. Wince." The bookshop smelled of dust and self-justification. Mr. Wince himself emerged from behind a stack of theology with the expression of a man accustomed to intellectual siege. "Inspector," he said briskly, "if this concerns the vicarage melodrama, I assure you I have better pursuits." "I have no doubt," Perbrite replied. "Where were you on Tuesday evening?" "In my shop until closing, then at the King's Arms." "Until what hour?" 9:30. "Can this be confirmed?" "Half the bar was present. After leaving the public house, I returned home directly." "Which lies in proximity to the vicarage," Perbrite said. "Proximity does not constitute intrusion. Did you walk past the vicarage gate?" "I may have. The pavement does not reroute itself for ecclesiastical sensitivities." "Did you enter the grounds?" "Certainly not." Perbrite regarded him with patient interest. "You were displeased with the Reverend's refusal regarding the book fair. I was disappointed. Displeasure implies emotional investment. Were you aware of the correspondence box in his study?" Mr. Wince gave a short laugh. "Everyone in this town is aware of everything placed upon a desk for more than a fortnight. And did you suppose it contained anything of use to you, to me?" "Inspector, if the Reverend maintains dossiers upon his parishioners, I have no appetite for them. Yet you have publicly criticized him, as is my democratic right." The exchange retained its civility, though beneath it lay a current of mutual appraisal. Perbrite thanked him and departed without comment. By midday, however, Mr. Wince's name had achieved unofficial prominence. His previous altercation, his proximity, his reputation for disputation, each supplied a convenient edge to the narrative. Even Mrs. Dalloway conceded that he is capable of theatrics. Purbright did not contradict this, but neither did he adopt it. He returned instead to the vicarage, requesting permission to examine the study once more in the daylight of accumulated testimony. The Reverend obliged, though Mrs. Ashcombe's composure had grown more brittle. "You cannot seriously imagine," she began, "that Mr. Wince would stoop to burglary." "Imagination is rarely required," Perbrite replied. "Facts suffice." He measured again the distance from window to hedge. The latch remained intact. The sill bore only the faint smear previously noted. On the carpet, near the desk, a minute thread of dark wool had caught against the edge of a chair leg. "Is this yours?" he asked, lifting it gently. Mrs. Ashcombe shook her head. "The Reverend does not wear such coarse material." Miss Harper, summoned from the kitchen, peered at it with disapproval. "Certainly not from this house." Purbright placed the thread carefully in an envelope. It was, he reflected, a triviality, yet trivialities in Flaxborough had a habit of persisting. "Inspector," the Reverend said quietly, "I trust we are not pursuing conjecture at the expense of charity." "On the contrary," Perbrite answered, "we pursue clarity. Charity may follow." As he left, he observed Mr. Blakely in the garden, trimming with deliberate strokes. The gardener's coat was of dark wool, though not recently frayed. Perbrite made no remark. Back at the station, Sergeant Love reported that several patrons of the King's Arms confirmed Mr. Wince's presence until shortly after 9. One insisted he had left in high dudgeon, though over what remained unspecified. "A convenient suspect," Love ventured. "Yes," Perbrite agreed. "Convenience is rarely conclusive." He considered the timeline anew. A car at 9, footsteps at past, a shopkeeper accounted for, at least publicly, a thread of wool unassigned, and a correspondence box was removed. Entirely. The first obvious suspect had provided an explanation, if not satisfaction. Yet something in the arrangement resisted simplicity. Mr. Wince was capable of grievance, perhaps even of gesture, but the removal of an entire container suggested a purpose more intimate than protest. In the square that evening, opinion had already hardened. The Vicarage Whisper now bore Mr. Wince's name in undertone. Inspector Purbright, however, found himself less persuaded by undertone than by omission. The Reverend's pause when asked about embarrassment lingered more insistently than any public quarrel, and in the quiet between assertion and proof, the matter waited to complicate itself. The matter waited, as such matters often did in Flaxborough, for something small enough to be overlooked by enthusiasm. Inspector Purbright had no objection to enthusiasm. He merely preferred that it not obstruct measurement. On Friday morning he returned once more to the vicarage, this time requesting to see not the study but the corridor beyond it. Mrs. Ashcombe received him with controlled hospitality. "I hope this will soon be concluded," she remarked. "The atmosphere has grown quite oppressive." "The atmosphere seldom requires encouragement," Perbrite replied mildly. "May I trouble you for a moment in the passage?" The corridor ran from the study toward the kitchen staircase, carpeted in a subdued pattern that had survived several ecclesiastical tenures. Perbrite walked its length with patient interest. "You mentioned," he said, "that the study door was locked at 9. "Yes," Miss Harper answered from behind them. "I locked it myself." "And who unlocked it in the morning?" "I did." "When I discovered the window open." Perbrite paused beside a small side table bearing a brass tray for post. Upon it lay 2 envelopes and a folded parish circular. "Were these delivered yesterday?" Mrs. Ashcombe glanced at them. "Yes." "The circular in the afternoon, the letters by the morning post." Perbrite lifted the circular. Its fold was crisp. Beneath it, faintly visible upon the tray's surface, lay a pale, rectangular outline of dust displaced in a shape that did not correspond to any object presently there. "Was anything else placed here recently?" he asked. Miss Harper frowned. "The Reverend sometimes sets his hat there." "This outline is too small for a hat," Purbright observed. Mrs. Ashcombe shifted slightly. "Perhaps a book. Which book?" "I cannot say." Perbrite nodded and replaced the circular. It was, in itself, insignificant a mark where something had rested and been removed. Yet the correspondence box had been taken from the study. If it had passed through this corridor, it might briefly have paused here. "Inspector," the Reverend said gently from the doorway, "is there some new development?" "Only out of curiosity," Purbright replied. "When you retired on Tuesday evening, did you carry anything from the study?" The Reverend hesitated. "Number. Did anyone else?" "Certainly not." The pause, though slight, reintroduced itself. Later that afternoon, Purbright called upon Sergeant Love to accompany him to the King's Arms. The public house, being the unofficial registry of civic sentiment, provided both refreshment and revision. Mr. Wince was present, engaged in earnest conversation with Mr. Pritchard. The latter fell silent upon the inspector's approach. "Gentlemen," Purbright began amiably, "a small matter of wool." Mr. Wince stiffened. "Wool?" A thread found in the vicarage study. Dark, coarse. Mr. Wince glanced down at his jacket. "Half the town wears dark wool in April." "Quite so. And yet it is remarkable how often threads attach themselves to chairs in unfamiliar rooms." "I have not entered that room," Mr. Wince said sharply. "Then we must seek another wearer." Mr. Pritchard coughed discreetly. "Blakely's coat is that colour." Purbright turned his head slightly. "The gardener?" "So I've noticed." Mr. Wince seized the opportunity. "There you are, Inspector. Practical access, groundsman, familiarity with windows." Purbright inclined his head without commitment. "We shall speak with Mr. Blakely again." As they left, Sergeant Love ventured, "It fits neatly, sir?" "Yes," Purbright replied. "Neatness should be regarded with caution." Before returning to the station, the inspector made one additional visit, this time to the home of Miss Prudence Hardwick. The organist answered in a housecoat of practical design. "Another question?" she asked coolly. "Only a detail," Perbrite said. "On Tuesday evening, did you write or receive any communication from the Reverend?" "Number. Have you ever placed an item upon the vicarage corridor table?" "Inspector. I have entered the house perhaps twice in the past year, and on those occasions, through the front door, under invitation. Did you ever see the correspondence box opened?" She regarded him steadily. "I have seen it closed." Purbright nodded. When he returned to the station, he reviewed the elements now assembled. A convenient suspect in Mr. Wince, a thread implicating perhaps the gardener, a motor car at 9, footsteps at past, and now a faint rectangular trace in the corridor suggesting that the missing box had rested there briefly. If the box had paused in the passage, it had not left the house immediately through the study window. It may have been carried deliberately to the front, which raised a quieter question. Why simulate entry at the window at all? Purbright removed his spectacles and polished them thoughtfully. The trivial outline upon the brass tray lingered more insistently than the wool thread. One suggested intrusion, the other arrangement. In Flaxborough, arrangements were seldom accidental. They were cultivated like reputations, like grievances, like tulips awaiting display, and somewhere between the window and hallway the act had shifted from theft to performance. Performance, once suspected, demanded an audience. Inspector Purbright did not immediately accuse the vicarage of staging its own disturbance. That would have been indelicate. Instead, he allowed the notion to settle privately while he widened his inquiries with deliberate impartiality. If the removal of the correspondence box had been arranged rather than forced, then its purpose lay not in concealment alone, but in suggestion. He began with Mrs. Harriet Mowbray, secretary of the parish social committee, whose cottage faced the side entrance to the vicarage grounds. Mrs. Mowbray possessed a talent for noticing arrivals disguised as departures. "Tuesday evening?" she repeated, adjusting her cardigan. There was movement, certainly. "Of what nature?" Perbrite asked. "I observed the Reverend's study light extinguished shortly before 9. Then, some minutes later, I saw a figure crossing the hall." "Through the window?" "Yes." "A silhouette only, male or female?" She hesitated. "I should say male, broad in the shoulders. Could it have been the Reverend himself?" "I suppose so," she admitted reluctantly. "But the gait seemed purposeful." "Purpose is not uncommon in corridors," Purbright observed. She leaned forward confidentially. "I also noticed the front door open briefly around 9:15. Did anyone emerge? I did not see clearly. The hedge obscures, yet you are certain it opened." "I saw the light shift." This detail did not align precisely with Mrs. Lamport's report of careful footsteps at 9:30. If the front door had opened at 9:15 and a motor car had been seen near 9, then the sequence invited reconsideration. Purbright thanked her and proceeded to the diocesan office, where Mr. Halford, a thin man with an administrative conscience, confirmed having written to the Reverend regarding roof repair funds. "We requested clarification," Mr. Halford explained. "There were discrepancies between projected costs and allocated reserves." "Discrepancies," Perbrite echoed mildly. "Timing issues," Mr. Halford corrected. "Was the correspondence cordial?" "As cordial as financial inquiries permit. Did you receive a reply?" "Yes, by post, not by hand." "No." Perbrite noted this without comment. If any letter from the diocese had been sensitive, it had already been dispatched beyond the vicarage. From there he called upon Councillor Edwin Larch, whose enthusiasm for municipal improvement occasionally exceeded his subtlety. "I have always maintained," Councillor Larch declared, "that the vicarage accounts required transparency." "On what grounds?" Perbrite asked. "On principle. Principle is a sturdy foundation," the inspector agreed. "Did you express this view to the Reverend?" "I did, recently, last month, at the Rotary dinner, and his response, dismissive." "Did you visit the vicarage on Tuesday?" "Certainly not. Have you ever entered the study?" "Once, to discuss flower show logistics. Did you observe the correspondence box?" Councillor Larch sniffed. One could hardly miss it. By late afternoon, the list of those who had quarrelled with, questioned, or mildly resented the Reverend Ashcombe had lengthened respectably. Miss Hardwick had disputed payment. Mr. Wince had contested access. Councillor Larch had raised concerns over accounts. The diocese had inquired about funds. Even Mrs. Mowbray hinted at purposeful silhouettes. The vicarage, in short, had accumulated grievances sufficient to populate a modest inquest. Yet the inspector returned persistently to the corridor's faint outline. If the box had been placed upon the brass tray before departure, then whoever carried it had passed through the house without haste. The study window, opened and left ajar, might then serve merely as an explanation. At dusk he revisited Mr. Blakely in the garden. "You were here until 5:30, Perbrite said conversationally. "Yes, sir. You have a key to the shed." "I do. And to the back gate?" "Only to the shed. Have you ever entered the house uninvited?" "Never." Perbrite regarded the gardener's coat again. Dark wool, but without visible fray. "Would you describe your relationship with the Reverend as amicable?" Mr. Blakely paused. "Professional." "Has he criticised your work?" "Once or twice. About trimming symmetry. Did that occasion resentment?" "Inspector," Mr. Blakely replied evenly. "Hedges recovered. Pride is less so." A measured answer, neither heated nor entirely neutral. When Perbrite returned to the station, Sergeant Love awaited him. "There's talk, sir, that the diocese may conduct its own review." "On the roof?" Of the accounts, Purbright removed his hat slowly. Reviews, when anticipated, sometimes prompt rearrangement. He considered the widening field. If the Reverend had reason to fear scrutiny, the disappearance of selected correspondence might forestall embarrassment. Alternatively, someone else might believe it. Outside, the town's speculation grew proportionate to its ignorance. The Vicarage Whisper had become less a rumour than a shared occupation. Inspector Perbrite, however, detected beneath the occupation a quieter pattern. Each grievance, though genuine in its way, seemed insufficient to explain the careful choreography of the window and corridor. The act had been deliberate, but whether it had been designed to conceal, to accuse, or to misdirect remained delicately unresolved. And in the vicarage study, beneath the sagging roof and the basin-catching April rain, the absence of the box had begun to suggest not merely removal, but anticipation. Anticipation, once suspected, seldom remained patient for long. On Saturday morning, as Flaxborough adjusted its habits to market day, and the tulips in Jubilee Square achieved their fullest municipal confidence, Miss Harper arrived at the police station in a state of affront that surpassed her previous agitation. "It has gone further," she announced, dispensing with pleasantries. "The roof fund ledger has disappeared." Inspector Perbrite looked up with measured attention. "From where?" "From the parish office. Locked cabinet. And this time, Inspector, there can be no suggestion of an accident." The ledger in question contained detailed records of the vicarage roof fund, subscriptions pledged, sums received, expenditures proposed. It had been a matter of recent interest to the diocese and to Councillor Larch. "When was it last seen?" Perbrite asked. "Yesterday afternoon. Mr. Ellis locked the cabinet at 5. And this morning, the cabinet was unlocked, the ledger was removed, nothing else disturbed." "Any sign of forced entry?" "None." Perbrite folded his hands briefly. "Does anyone besides Mr. Does Ellis possess a key?" "The Reverend and myself in emergencies." "And was the cabinet locked when you arrived?" "It was closed, but not secured." The repetition of pattern was unmistakable. An item of specific administrative sensitivity removed. No sign of violence. Nothing extraneous taken. Purbright accompanied Miss Harper to the parish office. Without delay, Mr. Ellis stood by the open cabinet, pale with injured propriety. "I locked it," he insisted. "I am certain." "I do not doubt your certainty," Purbright replied calmly. "May I?" He examined the cabinet. The lock bore no damage. Inside, files remained in orderly alignment, save for the absence of the ledger. "Has any duplicate been kept?" he asked. "No, the working copy was unique. Who knew of its contents?" "Several of us. The social committee, the diocese, Councillor Larch. Were there irregularities?" Mr. Ellis hesitated. "There were timing differences, promises not yet fulfilled." "By whom?" He avoided directness. "Various parties." The inspector noted the omission. As news of the second disappearance reached the square, the town's appetite sharpened. A single correspondence box might be mischief. A ledger removed under similar circumstances suggested design. Sergeant Love voiced the prevailing view. "It must be Wince, sir. First the Reverend's letters, now the accounts. He's making a point." "Possibly," Purbright said, "though burglars rarely limit themselves to documents. He wants to expose something." "Exposure generally requires revelation," Purbright replied. "We have seen none." By early afternoon, Mr. Wince was again under scrutiny. He received the inspector with brittle composure. "I suppose the ledger is my doing as well?" he inquired. "Where were you yesterday evening?" Purbright asked evenly. "In my shop until closing, then home." "Anyone with you?" "No." "Did you enter the parish office?" "Certainly not. You have expressed interest in parish finances. As a citizen?" "Yes." "Would you benefit from their disappearance?" Mr. Wince gave a short laugh. "Inspector, if I wish to challenge the accounts, I should demand to see them, not steal them." "An arguable strategy," Purbright conceded. As he departed, the inspector reflected that while Mr. Wince enjoyed dissent, he lacked the temperament for subtle choreography. The removals suggested caution rather than demonstration. That evening, Perbrite requested the presence of the Reverend Ashcombe at the station. "I regret the inconvenience," he began politely, "but the second incident alters the complexion of our inquiry. The Reverend's composure appeared thinner than before. You imply a connection. I imply a pattern. Surely you do not suspect me of misplacing my own accounts." "I suspect nothing without evidence," Purbright replied. "Yet both removals concern materials potentially subject to scrutiny." The Reverend's gaze lowered briefly. "The diocese has been persistent. About the roof fund?" "Yes. And have there been difficulties?" "Administrative ones only. Were you expecting a review?" The pause returned, longer this time. "There had been discussion." "Did you remove the correspondence box from your study on Tuesday evening?" The Reverend looked up sharply. "Certainly not. Did you place it upon the corridor table?" "No." Perbrite regarded him in silence. The denial was firm, but not expansive. Outside, the market stalls were being dismantled. Flaxborough's hum subsided into evening speculation. The second disappearance had shifted the direction of suspicion. Mr. Wince's grievance seemed peripheral. Attention drifted instead toward internal access keys, cabinets, corridors. If the first incident could be dismissed as an affront, the second demanded intention. And intention, in a town attentive to reputation, often grew from fear. As the Reverend departed the station, Purbright remained seated for some moments, considering the repetition of unlocked doors and undamaged latches. 2 removals, no violence, no profit, only papers whose existence invited inquiry. The pattern did not yet accuse, but it narrowed, and in the quiet between ledger and letter, the whisper began to resemble not gossip, but preparation. Preparation, once sensed, altered the tone of every subsequent gesture. Inspector Purbright did not immediately pursue further interviews. Instead, on Sunday morning, he attended the church service with unobtrusive punctuality. He occupied a pew sufficiently distant to discourage confessional proximity, yet near enough to observe. The Reverend Ashcombe preached upon stewardship. His voice retained its accustomed warmth, but beneath it lay a thread of insistence, as though the concept required urgent clarification. "Trust," he declared from the pulpit, "is a covenant sustained by openness." The congregation absorbed this with varying degrees of personal application. Councillor Larch nodded solemnly. Miss Hardwick's expression remained inscrutable. Mr. Wince did not attend. Purbright noted the cadence, the slight acceleration, when the Reverend referred to temporary misunderstandings, and the measured pause before the final hymn. It was not the sermon of a man indifferent to scrutiny. After the service, conversation collected in familiar clusters. The disappearance of the ledger had not yet been formally announced from the pulpit, but news in Flaxborough required no official endorsement. Mrs. Dalloway approached the inspector with subdued urgency. "It is most regrettable," she murmured. "2 such occurrences in 1 week. Regret is understandable," Perbrite replied. "Panic is less useful. You cannot deny that appearances are unfortunate." "Appearances," he said gently, "are rarely impartial." She lowered her voice. "Some feel the Reverend has been under strain, financial strain, reputational." This distinction lingered. Later that afternoon, Purbright walked the perimeter of the vicarage grounds alone. The hedge that screened the front path offered modest concealment. The back gate stood unremarkable. The study window, now firmly latched, reflected a sky of uncertain promise. He paused near the corridor window Mrs. Mowbray had mentioned. If a figure had crossed the hall at 9:15, and a motor car had stood nearby at 9. Then the interval between extinguished study light and opened front door required attention. Inside the vicarage, someone had moved with composure. He recalled the faint outline upon the brass tray. If the correspondence box had been carried there briefly, it had not departed through the study window. That aperture might have been opened afterward to suggest intrusion. The same logic applied to the parish office cabinet. Closed, not forced. Ledger removed without disturbance. A man anticipating review might seek to control which documents survived scrutiny. Yet anticipation required knowledge. Who had known the diocese would intensify its inquiry? Mr. Halford had written, Councillor Larch had spoken, Mr. Ellis had expressed concern. But only one individual stood at the centre of both sets of papers. That evening, Purbright invited Mr. Ellis for a quiet conversation at the station. "You appear troubled," he observed. "I am," Mr. Ellis admitted. The ledger was accurate. Were there entries that might be misconstrued? Delays in transferring certain sums? Transferred where? To a holding account, temporarily. At whose instruction? Mr. Ellis hesitated. The Reverend suggested it. For what purpose? To ensure the roof estimate appeared manageable. Perbrite remained silent. It was not improper, Mr. Ellis insisted, merely strategic. Strategic presentation, the inspector said. Yes, and were you aware that the diocese might conduct a review? They intimated as much. When? Last week? Before Tuesday? Yes. The pattern tightened. Did you inform the Reverend? I did. And how did he respond? He said it would be addressed. Perbrite nodded slowly. As Mr. Ellis departed, the inspector considered the moral architecture of the affair. No sums had vanished into private pockets. The transfers, though inelegant, might yet be reconciled, but revelation, especially in a town attentive to whisper, could erode trust more efficiently than embezzlement. If the correspondence box contained letters regarding delayed funds and the ledger recorded their path, then both removals served a single end: the elimination of paper trails before inspection. The Reverend's sermon on openness acquired new resonance. Yet one question persisted. Why stage the appearance of burglary rather than quietly misplace the documents? The answer, Perbrite reflected, lay in the town itself. An unexplained loss might invite inquiry inward. A simulated intrusion directed suspicion outward, toward grievance, toward Mr. Wince, toward any convenient dissenter. In Flaxborough, reputation was currency. To be seen as victim rather than author of irregularity offered protection. The Whisper, then, might not accuse from without, but defend from within. Purbright extinguished the station lamp and sat for a moment in the dimness. The pieces had not yet aligned fully, but their edges approached. And somewhere between stewardship and strategy, a performance awaited its final act. A performance, once suspected, required only a slight disturbance in lighting to expose its mechanics. On Monday morning, Inspector Purbright requested that a small meeting be convened at the vicarage that evening. The invitation was phrased with tact, a brief discussion concerning recent misunderstandings. Those asked to attend included the Reverend Ashcombe, Mrs. Ashcombe, Mr. Ellis, Councillor Larch, and Miss Hardwick. Mr. Wince, notably, was not summoned. The omission did not pass unnoticed in the square. At 7:30, as the April light faded with habitual moderation, the assembled parties took their seats in the vicarage sitting-room. The roof above, temporarily patched, dripped no longer. A basin remained, however, as precaution. Perbrite stood near the mantel, hands loosely clasped. "I am grateful for your attendance," he began. "The removal of certain documents has occasioned concern." "Concern?" Councillor Larch echoed. "Outrage would be nearer the mark." "Outrage is rarely productive," Perbrite replied. "Evenly." Clarity, on the other hand, can be. He allowed silence to settle. It has been widely assumed, he continued, that these removals were acts of external mischief. Miss Hardwick inclined her head slightly. Mr. Ellis avoided the Reverend's gaze. However, Purbright went on, both incidents share characteristics inconsistent with opportunistic intrusion. The Reverend's expression remained composed. You refer to the absence of forced entry, among other things. He turned gently toward Mrs. Ashcombe. On Tuesday evening, you retired at what hour? Shortly after 9. And you heard nothing thereafter? Nothing. Yet Mrs. Mowbray observed the front door open at 9:15. Mrs. Ashcombe's composure flickered. She must be mistaken. Possibly, Perbrite said, but Mr. Cattermole observed a motor car near the hedge at 9. Councillor Larch leaned forward. There you have it. Yes, Purbright agreed softly. There we have a motor car, briefly present. He allowed the implication to hover before withdrawing it. The correspondence box was not removed through the study window, he said quietly. It passed through the corridor. It rested briefly upon the brass tray. Mrs. Ashcombe's hands tightened in her lap. I discovered a faint outline, Purbright continued, suggesting that the box was carried toward the front of the house before the window was opened. The Reverend's gaze shifted, not toward his wife, but toward the carpet. Likewise, Perbrite went on, the roof fund ledger was removed from a locked cabinet without force. Only those possessing keys could accomplish this. Mr. Ellis swallowed. Inspector, the Reverend said at last, are you implying I am implying nothing yet? Perbrite replied gently. I merely observe that both documents concerned administrative matters subject to review. Councillor Larch cleared his throat. The diocese had requested clarification. Yes, Perbrite said, and that request proceeded Tuesday. He moved slightly closer to the Reverend. May I ask, he said, whether you anticipated that certain entries in the ledger might prove awkward? The room held its breath. There were no improprieties, the Reverend said firmly. I did not suggest impropriety, Perbrite answered, only timing. Mr. Ellis spoke unexpectedly. The funds were to be restored. The Reverend's head turned sharply. Perbrite's voice remained mild, transferred temporarily to ease the appearance of projected costs. Mrs. Ashcombe closed her eyes briefly. I have no desire, Perbrite continued, to transform administrative misjudgment into scandal, yet the removal of documents creates the very impression it seeks to avoid. Silence deepened. Inspector, Miss Hardwick said coolly, if the documents were not taken by Mr. Wince, then by whom? Purbright regarded the Reverend steadily. Someone, he said, who had both knowledge of impending review and access to keys. Someone who would benefit from the appearance of victimhood rather than scrutiny. Councillor Larch shifted uncomfortably. You cannot seriously suggest he began. I suggest only, Purbright interrupted softly, that the window was opened after the box had been carried through the house, that the ledger cabinet was left unlocked deliberately, that these acts were not hurried but considered. The Reverend rose slowly. This is intolerable, he said. You accuse me without evidence. I accuse no one, Purbright replied. I simply note that the documents have not yet been destroyed. Every eye turned to him. Destroyed? Mrs. Ashcombe whispered. Yes, Purbright said. They were not removed to eliminate evidence entirely. They were removed to prevent immediate inspection, a temporary measure. He allowed his gaze to rest once more upon the Reverend. I expect, he concluded quietly, that they will soon reappear, perhaps discovered in some outbuilding, the unfortunate result of misunderstanding. The suggestion lay upon the room like a mirror. The Reverend's composure wavered at last. And in that wavering, the performance approached its final cue. The wavering, once visible, did not immediately collapse into confession. The Reverend Ashcombe remained standing, one hand resting upon the back of his chair, as though steadying himself against a moral draught. "You place me in an impossible position, Inspector," he said with measured dignity. "To suggest that I should contrive theft within my own house is preposterous. Contrivance need not be criminal in intent," Purbright replied calmly. "It may arise from anxiety." "Anxiety?" Councillor Larch repeated, with a note of triumph poorly disguised as indignation. Perbrite inclined his head. The diocese intimated review. The ledger contained entries that, though not dishonest, might invite misunderstanding. The correspondence box likely contained letters referring to those entries. Mrs. Ashcombe spoke at last, her composure frayed. The sums were to be restored within the month. "That was the intention, mister," Ellis said faintly. "The difficulty," Perbrite continued gently, "was not the temporary transfer itself, but the anticipation of its discovery before rectification." The Reverend's shoulders lowered fractionally. "You misjudged me," he said quietly. "I hope so," Purbright answered. "Yet the evidence suggests deliberation rather than intrusion." He moved toward the study door, which stood open beyond the sitting room. "On Tuesday evening," he said, "the study light was extinguished shortly before 9. Shortly thereafter, a figure crossed the hall. The correspondence box was carried to the corridor table, where it rested momentarily. The front door opened at 9:15. A motor car waited briefly outside. Miss Hardwick's eyes narrowed. "You drove that motor car," Reverend Purbright said evenly. The silence that followed was not theatrical. It was exhausted. The Reverend closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them without defiance. "I intended only to remove certain letters," he said at last, "to prevent misinterpretation." "By whom?" Councillor Larch demanded. "By those eager for scandal," the Reverend replied, with an edge. Purbright's tone remained unhurried. "You then opened the study window from within to suggest external entry." "Yes." "And on Friday, anticipating continued scrutiny, you removed the roof fund ledger from the parish office." The Reverend did not answer immediately. "I did not wish the town to believe," he said slowly, "that the roof fund had been mishandled." "Yet by staging theft," Perbrite observed, "you invited precisely the suspicion you sought to avoid." Mrs. Ashcombe rose beside her husband. "It was not greed," she said firmly. "The roof required urgent assessment. The estimate alarmed the committee. Theodore sought only to manage perception." "Perception," Perbrite repeated softly, "is a fragile asset." Mr. Ellis found his voice. "I should have insisted upon transparency." Councillor Larch shifted, chastened. There would have been questions. "Yes," Perbrite said, "questions are preferable to whispers." The Reverend sank back into his chair. "The documents are safe," he said, "in the boot of my motor car." Miss Hardwick allowed herself a single, dry exhalation, a most pastoral hiding place. Perbrite did not smile. "I shall retrieve them," the Reverend continued, "and submit them to the diocese forthwith." "That would be advisable," Perbrite agreed. "The matter need not extend beyond administrative correction." Councillor Larch appeared disappointed by the absence of spectacle. "There will be no charges?" he asked. "None," Perbrite replied. "No funds were misappropriated for private gain. No false entries made beyond timing adjustments. The greater offence has been to trust." The Reverend bowed his head slightly. "Then I have failed?" "Temporarily," Perbrite said. "Rectification remains available." Mrs. Ashcombe regarded the inspector with mingled gratitude and humiliation. "You will not publicize this? I have no interest in inflaming." "What can be resolved?" he answered. The meeting dissolved without ceremony. Councillor Larch departed in subdued reflection. Miss Hardwick paused only long enough to remark, "Stewardship benefits from sunlight," before leaving. When the room had emptied, Purbright lingered briefly with the Reverend. "The Whisper," he said quietly, "thrives where explanation falters. Offer the town clarity, and it will tire of speculation." The Reverend nodded. Outside, the square had settled into evening quiet. The tulips, indifferent to human miscalculation, remained upright. By morning, the correspondence box and the ledger would be returned to their rightful places, accompanied by an announcement of accounting adjustment and diocesan review. The narrative would shift from intrigue to correction. As Inspector Perbrite walked back toward the station, he reflected that in Flaxborough, crimes were rarely violent. They arose instead from embarrassment, pride, and the subtle dread of diminished esteem. And it was reputation, not money, that had nearly been mislaid. By Tuesday morning, the documents had resumed their respective habitats with a modest air of having travelled unnecessarily. The correspondence box reappeared upon the Reverend's desk, its polished surface reflecting the study window with untroubled composure. The roof fund ledger was restored to the parish office cabinet, now secured with a diligence bordering upon penitence. A brief notice was circulated after matins. Certain accounting entries would be clarified in consultation with the diocese. No mention was made of theft. Flaxborough absorbed the announcement with collective restraint. The Vicarage Whisper did not vanish, it thinned. Mrs. Dalloway, encountering Mrs. Mowbray outside the greengrocer's, remarked that administrative misunderstandings are more common than one imagines. Mrs. Mowbray replied that she had imagined rather more dramatic developments. Both agreed that transparency was a virtue best admired from a safe distance. At the King's Arms, Mr. Wince enjoyed the temporary vindication of having been publicly suspected and privately exonerated. He accepted congratulations with the composure of a man who had been unjustly aligned with mediocrity. "I said from the beginning," he observed, "that the matter was internal." "You said it was theatrical," Mr. Pritchard corrected. "The two are not mutually exclusive. Inspector Purbright permitted the town its revisions. He did not correct embellishment unless it threatened to reconstitute itself as an injury." The Reverend Ashcombe addressed the congregation the following Sunday with measured candour. He acknowledged that in an excess of prudence he had removed documents pending clarification. He did not employ the word staged, though it hovered politely between sentences. "I erred," he said simply. "In seeking to prevent misunderstanding, I created it." The confession, though understated, achieved what contrivance had not. Councillor Larch nodded in approval. Miss Hardwick inclined her head in faint satisfaction. Mr. Ellis appeared relieved to inhabit straightforward arithmetic once more. Mrs. Ashcombe resumed her habitual dignity, though her gaze now rested longer upon open doors. The diocese conducted its review with professional calm. The transferred sums were restored formally, explanatory notes appended. No further irregularities were found. As for the roof, it continued to sag with patient expectation, its eventual repair financed not by concealment but by subscription. Inspector Perbrite returned to his paperwork with the quiet industry that defined his office. Sergeant Love, filing the matter under administrative adjustment, ventured, "It could have been worse, sir." "It often is," Perbrite replied. "Strange business, not especially. Love considered this. You don't call it theft?" "No," Perbrite said, "I call it anxiety with initiative." The phrase satisfied neither legal categorization nor gossip, but it suited the truth. In Jubilee Square the tulips began at last to droop. Market day resumed its habitual rhythm. The phrase Vicarage Whisper survived only as a conversational relic, invoked occasionally to suggest the dangers of over-managing appearance. Miss Hardwick resumed her rehearsals without further dispute over remuneration. Mr. Wince proposed relocating the book fair to the library courtyard and secured permission without difficulty. Councillor Larch discovered new enthusiasm for drainage improvements. The Reverend Ashcombe, perhaps chastened, invited the social committee to inspect the vicarage accounts personally. The invitation was accepted with enthusiasm, moderated by curiosity. Trust, once tested, rarely returns unaltered, yet in Flaxborough it seldom departed entirely. It merely adjusted its posture. One afternoon, as Inspector Purbright crossed the square, he paused to observe the vicarage windows. They stood closed, curtains drawn back. Nothing in there. Arrangement suggested performance. The whisper had subsided not through spectacle, but through admission. In a town attentive to nuance, that proved sufficient. Perbrite removed his hat briefly to acknowledge Mrs. Dalloway's passing carriage. She inclined her head with renewed composure. The matter was concluded, no arrests recorded, no charges filed, only a quiet correction in the ledger of reputation. And in the station office, beneath the steady hum of routine, Inspector Perbrite entered the final notation with customary restraint. Administrative misjudgment, rectified. He closed the file without flourishing. Outside, the roof awaited its repair.